Every Sunday, the sanctuary shook with hallelujahs. Thousands of voices raised in praise, hands lifted toward heaven, tears of joy streaming down faces of the faithful. But beneath Pastor Emmanuel's marble altar, something even heaven refused to hear was calling from the darkness below. This is the true story of the man they called the miracle shepherd. The pastor who could heal the blind, fill empty wallets, and predict tomorrow's weather with supernatural accuracy. Crowds flocked from across West Africa. Pockets emptied in offering buckets, testimonies multiplied like loaves and fishes. But miracles, as you're about to discover, are rarely free, and some are paid for in flesh and bone. Stay with me, because before this nightmare ends, you'll witness the most shocking discovery ever made beneath a house of God. Make sure you subscribe right now, because this journey into the darkest corners of faith and corruption will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about divine power. Picture this: Lagos, Nigeria. A fast-growing Pentecostal church that went from a small storefront to a massive complex in just 3 years. Neon crusade posters on every lamppost, promising miracles, healing, and breakthrough. Every Sunday morning, congregants would queue from dawn, desperate for a touch from the man who seemed to have a direct hotline to heaven. Pastor Emmanuel Adebayo was everything a modern mega-church pastor should be. Charismatic smile that could melt hearts from the back row. Designer suits that cost more than most people's annual salary. And a gold-leaf Bible that he claimed had been personally anointed in Jerusalem by angels themselves. The miracles started small. A woman with chronic headaches was healed during his first crusade. A man's business debt mysteriously disappeared overnight after Emmanuel prayed over his bank statements. A couple married for 15 years suddenly conceived twins. Word spread like wildfire through Lagos. Within months, Emmanuel's congregation had grown from 50 members to over 10,000. But there was something else growing along with his fame. Something that made old-timers in the community uncomfortable. Baba Kazim, an elderly gravedigger who had worked in Lagos cemeteries for over 40 years, would watch the streams of people heading to Emmanuel's church and shake his head. "No power rises without a debt," he would whisper to his grandson Jeed. "And when the bill comes due, it's always paid in blood." Baba Kazim had seen enough in his decades of burying the dead to recognize when something unnatural was at work. The first real sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday night. Baba Kazim was walking past the church complex around midnight when he saw something that made his blood run cold. Church elders were unloading bags of cement from a truck. Heavy bags that they carried not toward the construction site where the new fellowship hall was being built, but toward the main sanctuary, toward the altar. At midnight, in complete secrecy, he watched from the shadows as they made trip after trip, carrying those cement bags through the front doors of the church. When they finished, the truck disappeared into the Lagos night without ever turning on its headlights. The next Sunday, Baba Kazim attended service for the first time in years. Pastor Emmanuel was more powerful than ever. His voice seemed to carry supernatural authority. When he called for the sick to come forward, people were healed instantly. When he prayed for financial breakthrough, congregants began shouting testimonies of unexpected money. But Baba Kazim noticed something else. The area around the altar steps had fresh, damp patches in the marble. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable to someone who had spent 40 years around death. The smell of wet clay, and something organic decomposing beneath. Enter Amara Okonkwo, a 22-year-old university student studying medicine at the University of Lagos. Smart, skeptical, and the last person you'd expect to become a regular at Pastor Emmanuel's church. But then her mother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. The doctors gave her 3 months to live. Chemotherapy wasn't working. The family had exhausted their savings on treatments that only made her weaker. In desperation, Amara's aunt convinced them to bring her mother to Pastor Emmanuel's healing crusade. Amara went reluctantly, her scientific mind rebelling against the idea that prayer could cure what medicine couldn't touch. But what happened that night changed everything. Pastor Emmanuel laid hands on her mother and prayed with an intensity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Other congregants fell to their knees around them, speaking in tongues, crying out in spiritual fervor. And then something impossible happened. Her mother's pain vanished, instantly, completely. Within a week, follow-up scans showed the tumors had shrunk by 70%. Within a month, they were gone entirely. Amara's mother was healed, but instead of making Amara a true believer, the miracle made her suspicious. Her medical training told her that cancer didn't just disappear overnight. There had to be an explanation. So she started attending church regularly, not as a worshipper, but as an investigator. She volunteered to join the choir, which gave her access to parts of the church building that regular congregants never saw. And that's when she started noticing things that didn't make sense. The choir room was directly above the main sanctuary, with air vents that connected to the space below the altar. During evening rehearsals, when the church was supposed to be empty, Amara would hear sounds coming through those vents. Muffled sounds, like someone trying to scream through a gag. She mentioned it to other choir members, but they brushed it off. Old building, they said, pipes settling, wind in the vents. But Amara knew the difference between building noises and human sounds. She also noticed the missing person posters. Lagos was a big city, and people went missing all the time. But Amara started keeping track, and she noticed a pattern. People would disappear in the weeks leading up to Pastor Emmanuel's biggest crusades. And then, during those crusades, new testimony givers would appear. People with similar builds, similar ages, similar life stories to those who had gone missing. It was subtle. Nothing that would be obvious unless you were specifically looking for it. But Amara was looking. The breakthrough came when she met Jeed, Baba Kazim's grandson. Jide was a computer science student with a talent for hacking and a grandfather who had been warning him about Pastor Emmanuel for months. When Amara shared her suspicions with him, everything clicked into place. "My grandfather saw them carrying cement into the church," Jide told her. "He thinks they're building something under the altar." Like what? Like graves. The plan they hatched was dangerous, but it was the only way to get answers. During the church's monthly all-night vigil, when hundreds of congregants would be praying and singing until dawn, Amara and Jeed would slip away and explore the areas beneath the main sanctuary. Jide had already hacked into the church's security system and identified the blind spots in their camera coverage. He knew exactly how to get into the restricted areas without being detected. The night of the vigil, as Pastor Emmanuel led the congregation in hours of intense prayer and worship, Amara and Jeed made their move. They slipped through a maintenance door that led to the church's basement level, the area that was supposed to be used for storage and utilities. But what they found was something else entirely. The basement air was thick and warm, like being inside an oven. There was that smell again, wet clay mixed with something organic and rotting. Using their phone flashlights, they navigated through a maze of concrete corridors until they found what they were looking for, a room directly beneath the main altar. What they saw inside that room will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Hand-built tombs, rough concrete structures that looked like they had been hastily constructed. Fresh soil scattered around them, and embedded in the concrete, rosaries, crosses, and what looked like human hair. But the most chilling discovery was what they found when they looked closer at the fresh soil. It wasn't soil at all. It was loose dirt that had been recently disturbed. And underneath, Jide's flashlight caught something pale sticking up through the earth. A human hand, reaching upward as if trying to claw its way to the surface. Amara almost screamed. Jeed grabbed her arm to steady her as the full horror of what they were seeing hit them both. People weren't just buried here. They had been buried alive. That's when they heard footsteps above them. Heavy footsteps moving across the sanctuary floor, heading in their direction. Their flashlight died. In the pitch-black darkness, they heard a voice that made their blood freeze. Pastor Emmanuel's voice, calm and conversational, speaking to someone else. Even King David buried his enemies beneath holy ground, he was saying. The Old Testament is full of precedents for what we do here. Amara and Jide pressed themselves against the wall, trying to become invisible in the darkness. "The next offering must be soon," Emmanuel continued. "The power is waning. I can feel it during services. The miracles are getting harder to maintain." Another voice, one of the church elders. "Who do you have in mind, Pastor?" "The girl with the healed mother." Amara. She's been asking too many questions, and her mother's healing created a spiritual debt that must be paid. Heaven demands an exchange for every miracle. Amara's heart stopped. They were talking about killing her. When? The elder asked. Tomorrow night, during the healing service. We'll say she was overcome by the Holy Spirit and taken home to glory. The footsteps began moving away, but Emmanuel's final words echoed through the underground chamber. Prepare the altar, and make sure the cement is mixed properly this time. We can't have any more disturbances from below. Jide grabbed Amara's hand and pulled her through the darkness toward the way they had come. They had to get out. They had to tell someone. They had to stop this madness. But more importantly, they had to survive the next 24 hours. As they emerged from the basement, the all-night vigil was still in full swing. Hundreds of people singing, praying, completely unaware that they were worshipping directly above a mass grave. Jide immediately began uploading the footage he had secretly recorded to every social media platform he could access. Within minutes, #Altar of Bones was trending across Nigerian Twitter. Videos of the underground burial chamber, audio recordings of Pastor Emmanuel's conversation, evidence that one of the country's most beloved religious leaders was a serial killer. But Pastor Emmanuel had friends in high places, politicians whose campaigns he had funded, police officers who attended his church, judges who had received donations for their community programs. The official response was swift and predictable: fake news, doctored videos, an attack on a man of God by jealous enemies. The police commander announced that they would investigate these serious allegations thoroughly, but everyone knew what that meant in Nigeria. The investigation would disappear into bureaucratic quicksand. But the people of Lagos were not willing to wait for official justice. Word spread through the city like wildfire. By sunset the next day, thousands of people had gathered outside Pastor Emmanuel's church, not to worship, but to demand answers. Congregants who had given their life savings to the ministry, parents whose missing children matched the timeline of the burial dates, journalists whose questions had been deflected for too long. Pastor Emmanuel, realizing that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling, made a desperate decision. He called an emergency healing service for that evening. A special prayer meeting for spiritual warfare against the demons of false accusation. But what he really planned was a final massive human sacrifice. A dozen people buried at once to give him enough power to weather the storm and rebuild somewhere else. As the crowd gathered outside, he locked the doors of the sanctuary from the inside, trapping over 1,000 people inside with him. Tonight, he announced to his captive congregation, "We will have the greatest miracle service in the history of this ministry, but it will require the ultimate sacrifice from some of God's chosen vessels." That's when Amara, who had been hiding in the choir loft, grabbed the church's public address microphone and broadcast Pastor Emmanuel's recorded confession to every speaker in the building. His voice, caught on Jide's phone the night before, filled the sanctuary. Even King David buried his enemies beneath holy ground. The next offering must be soon. Heaven demands an exchange for every miracle. The reaction was immediate and explosive. 1,000 people who had believed they were in the presence of a holy man suddenly realized they were trapped with a monster. Panic, rage, and horror erupted simultaneously. Outside, the crowd heard the screaming from inside the locked church. Jide, who had been coordinating with journalists and human rights activists, called every emergency service in Lagos. But it was the people themselves who took action. Using construction equipment from a nearby building site, they began battering down the reinforced doors of the church. Inside, congregants overpowered the ushers who had been trying to maintain order. Chairs flew, windows shattered. People fought their way toward the exits. And then, in the middle of the chaos, nature itself seemed to join the fight for justice. A massive thunderstorm struck Lagos with supernatural intensity. Lightning split the sky in violent sheets. Thunder crashed overhead like the judgment of God himself. And then, in a moment that everyone who witnessed it will remember for the rest of their lives, a bolt of lightning struck the metal cross on top of the church. Electrical fire raced through the building's wiring. Sparks rained down onto the altar where Pastor Emmanuel was standing, still trying to convince people that he was God's chosen servant. The fire suppression system activated, flooding the sanctuary with water. And that's when the ground beneath the altar began to give way. The cement and soil that had been hastily poured over the burial chamber couldn't withstand the combination of water and structural damage. The floor collapsed, and in front of 1,000 horrified witnesses with dozens of people live streaming to social media, the altar cracked open to reveal the horror beneath. Skeletal hands reaching upward through the mud and water, fragments of clothing, jewelry that family members would later recognize as belonging to their missing loved ones. The evidence was undeniable, inescapable, broadcast live to the world. Pastor Emmanuel tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The congregation that had once worshipped him now surrounded him with fury that bordered on murderous. He was screaming Bible verses, claiming that angels would resurrect him at dawn, insisting that everything he had done was commanded by God. But his words fell on deaf ears. The police, who had been reluctant to investigate when the evidence was just videos and accusations, had no choice when faced with human remains being pulled from beneath a church altar on live television. Pastor Emmanuel was arrested that night, dragged from his sanctuary in handcuffs while the world watched. The aftermath was swift and devastating. Excavation of the burial chamber revealed 5 complete skeletons. DNA testing matched them to missing persons reports filed over the past 18 months. Each victim had disappeared in the weeks leading up to Pastor Emmanuel's major crusades. Each had been buried alive beneath the altar where thousands of people came to pray. The national media descended on Lagos like vultures. Politicians who had been photographed with Pastor Emmanuel suddenly developed amnesia about their relationships with him. Banks froze the church's accounts. Properties were seized. The massive complex that had been built on the blood of innocent people was shuttered and abandoned. But for the survivors, the justice was bittersweet. Many congregants struggled with guilt. How had they funded these murders with their offerings? How had they praised God while standing above a mass grave? Others battled with their faith itself. If Pastor Emmanuel's miracles were real, but powered by human sacrifice, what did that say about the nature of divine power? And then there were the personal costs. Amara's mother, whose cancer had been healed by Pastor Emmanuel's prayers, began experiencing symptoms again within weeks of his arrest. The miracle that had saved her life was apparently as temporary as the man who had performed it. Her cancer returned more aggressively than before, as if it was making up for lost time. Within 6 months, she was gone. The price of the miracle, it seemed, had simply been delayed. Today, if you drive past the abandoned church complex in Lagos, you'll see something that chills the soul. The building stands empty. Doors chained shut, windows boarded up. The parking lot where thousands once gathered, now cracked and overgrown with weeds. But the most disturbing part is what people report hearing at night. Local residents claim that when the wind is right, you can still hear sounds coming from beneath the ground. Singing. A choir of voices rising and falling in harmony. Not the joyful praise that once filled the sanctuary, but something haunting and mournful. The voices of those who paid the ultimate price for someone else's false miracles. Pastor Emmanuel died in prison before his trial could be completed. Prison officials said it was suicide, but inmates told a different story. They claimed he was found in his cell, apparently trying to dig through the concrete floor with his fingernails, muttering about needing to feed the altar one more time. His final words, according to witnesses, were, "The debt must be paid, the debt must always be paid." The investigation that followed Emmanuel's arrest uncovered a network of similar operations across West Africa. Pastors who had learned the same ancient ritual. Churches built over secret burial chambers. Miracles powered by human sacrifice. It was a corruption of faith so profound that it shook the foundation of religious trust across the continent. But it also revealed something else. The power of ordinary people to expose evil when they refused to stay silent. Amara and Jeed, 2 university students with nothing but smartphones and courage, had brought down a religious empire that seemed untouchable. Their bravery cost them everything. Amara lost her mother. Jeed's family was forced to relocate after receiving death threats from Emmanuel's remaining followers, but they saved countless lives. The people who would have been the next victims. The families who would have lost loved ones to feed a madman's appetite for power. And they reminded the world that true miracles don't require human sacrifice. Real healing, real hope, real faith. These things grow from love, not fear. From service, not exploitation. From lifting people up, not burying them alive. There's a memorial now on the site where Pastor Emmanuel's church once stood. Not an official one. The government was too embarrassed by their failure to investigate earlier, but the community built one anyway. 5 simple headstones arranged in a circle, each bearing the name of a victim whose family never got to say goodbye properly. And in the center, a plaque with words that serve as both warning and promise, in memory of those who died for false miracles. May their sacrifice ensure that evil disguised as good never again finds root in holy ground. Every Sunday, people still gather there, not to worship, but to remember, to honor the dead, to support the survivors, to promise that they will never again let fear and desperation blind them to the difference between true faith and deadly deception. Because the most important lesson from Pastor Emmanuel's reign of terror isn't about the power of evil, it's about the power of truth. Truth spoken by brave young people who refused to be intimidated. Truth that penetrated through lies and corruption and false miracles. Truth that even when it costs everything is always worth fighting for. And sometimes, just sometimes, truth is the greatest miracle of all. What price would you pay for a miracle? More importantly, what price would you refuse to pay? If this story shook you to your core, hit that subscribe button right now, because next week we're diving into another shocking true story from Nigeria that will make you question everything you think you know about power, corruption, and the lengths people will go to maintain their secrets. Hit that notification bell, smash the like button if you believe truth always triumphs over evil, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people can expose extraordinary evil when they have the courage to speak up. Because in a world where wolves often dress in sheep's clothing, the greatest protection we have is refusing to close our eyes to what's happening right in front of us. Sometimes the most dangerous place isn't a dark alley or a crime-ridden neighborhood. Sometimes it's a place where people come seeking hope and find horror instead. But as long as there are people like Amara and Jeed in the world, evil will never have the final word. Truth will always find a way to rise from the grave.